and his listeners, a man whose rhetoric was first class. And so there was judgment going on, there was evaluation, there was comparison. And Paul is so conscious of this, not for his own sake, you understand. Perhaps I can explain that in a minute. But he was very conscious of the kind of comparisons, these odious comparisons that were going on in the church. In 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 and 2, he actually says this. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it's required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. Now, what's he doing here? He's bringing them back to fundamentals. He's saying, look, you people are thinking about the wrong things. You're looking for the wrong things. You're estimating the wrong things. Ministers are stewards. Stewards are servants. What's required in people like us is not that we can put a string of words together, but that we are faithful. That we are faithful in the things that God has given us to do. And so there was this background of comparison and of criticism, and of course Paul was very much aware of the way that some people in the church were thinking about him. And so further on in that chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, verses 3 and 4, he says this, "But with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court." He's telling them what he thinks about their judgment. It's the Lord who judges me. And then he says, therefore don't pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, because that's the judgment that counts. He will bring to light the purposes of the heart. And here's a man who was able to say that he had a clear conscience about the manner of his ministry. But you understand that that was the kind of burden under which Paul labored in all the time that he was there at Corinth. He was there for 18 months, laboring among these people, giving everything, working with his own hands so as not to make the gospel chargeable to them in financial terms. And this is what was going on. And the real issue here is that the people who were making these judgments really didn't understand the danger they were in. They didn't understand what they were doing. Now here's a lesson for us at this juncture in our history as a congregation, in your history as a congregation. To think about the right things, to get the basics right, to go for the first things and not for the secondary. The dangers associated with making those comparisons are these: that you actually move in your thinking from a Christ-centered evaluation to a man-centered evaluation. What were they doing? They had taken their eyes off Christ. And they were looking at men. And of course you have to look at men, but what he's saying is that you have to look at them in the right way. How do you evaluate a minister of Christ? It's by his faithfulness to Christ. It's all very basic stuff, of course. And there's this danger also of a method-centered evaluation instead of a message-centered evaluation. Concentrating on the packaging instead of on the content. And how often does that happen in churches up and down the country these days, in your country and in mine, where people are captivated by the packaging and not by the content, not by the actual message. And so, as the packaging increases, the content decreases. There's a correlation between the two. Paul could see all that. He understood those things. And that's why he was so concerned. And you know, when people switch in that way from Christ-centered to man-centered, and from message-centered to packaging-centered, method-centered, if you like, that affects the way they listen. And it also affects the way men preach. It does both those things. And you would be surprised, or would you, what effect you can have on people like me when I'm in the pulpit. Now you think about these things. The Apostle Paul knew about it firsthand. The way you think, the way you are, the things you concentrate on have a direct effect upon the man in the pulpit. And the worst case scenario, of course, is that the man, like the Apostle Paul, picks up the vibes. He hears what people are saying and how they are thinking, and he begins to modify the content, modify the message. And suddenly, there's a change in what he says. And he is less faithful as a steward of the mysteries of God, because he is living down to the expectation of his people. Paul was very concerned about that. So he had a simple approach to his ministry. That word simplicity means without deception, no hidden agendas and stuff. He was conscious of these differences that operate in the thinking and the attitude of people in the church. And he had learned the need for simplicity of heart and simplicity of manner. Not carnality. Let's not have a fleshly approach to the ministry of the gospel. And he says that in these verses. If you look at them very carefully, he says, not earthly wisdom. The word in the Greek is fleshly or carnal. Not carnal wisdom, not worldly wisdom, but the grace of God. That's the essence of the matter. It's nothing to do with sophistry. There's not to be any kind of smokescreen which anyone who has a capacity for speaking can set up. It's not being culture conscious in one's delivery of the gospel. It's not making seeker-sensitive refinements to the substance of the message. We are dealing with the irreducibles here. That's what he's saying. You can't translate them into anything else. If there's a bitterness in the pill, you can't sweeten it. Neither should you make the sweetness of the gospel bitter. But people who are attuned to this kind of thing rarely do that, because they feel the need to please their listeners. And so you see, Paul's conscience was clear, because the manner of his ministry was one of great simplicity. I don't mean that there was nothing demanding about it at all. This word simplicity simply means that there was no duplicity in it. There was no other agenda. There were no hidden motives. He was completely upfront. And he could afford to be upfront because he trusted what he had to say. He knew what the gospel was. The gospel is God's power to salvation for everyone who believes it. He understood that. He didn't need anything else. Preach the gospel. Preach the truth. It's enough. It's the power of God, don't you understand? But they didn't. So he had learned that the effective ministry is down to grace alone, not to sophistry, not to carnal wisdom. And that's the principle by which he operated in his ministry. That was behind the way he did things. In 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 7, he asks these questions. Well, what then is Apollos? As able as he is, what then is he? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. When you understand all that, you see it impinges upon what you say in ministry, and it impinges upon what you think about ministry as the people of God. And so for Paul, you see, he never felt the need to innovate. He never felt the need to create programs. He never felt the need to add to the message or to deduct anything from it. He never felt the need to be creative in that sense. And so what he says in 2 Corinthians 1:13 is this: we are not writing to you anything other than what you read and acknowledge, and I hope you will fully acknowledge. This is stuff that they were familiar with. They were familiar with his whole approach to ministry as well as his message. And they had to acknowledge, they should have acknowledged, the simplicity of his manner. Some pastors and some teachers are not that simple. In terms of their motivation, they can be in the ministry for wrong reasons, they can have mixed motives, and all of that can be reflected in their ministry. I'm not going to go in that direction now. But ministers, he says, are called to faithfulness. And listen to this: ministers are called to faithfulness, not success. Success is God's business, not theirs. Well, then we come to this simplicity of his method, and this has to do with how he organized his time and made his plans and settled his aims and so on and so forth. And the first thing I want to say is that he did have clear aims, in spite of what people seem to be saying about him. He was able to map his ministry out in a principled way, even if that cost him a great deal in personal terms. And if you look at verse 15 and verse 16, he says, because I was so sure of this, I wanted to come to you first, so that you might have a second experience of grace. Now, he's saying something quite remarkable here. I think people in Corinth must have thought he was plain daft. I mean, you know, to want to go back there after all he'd had to put up with the first time round. And since then, who in his right mind could envisage that a second visit would involve an experience of grace for him? Well, he didn't mean that. Of course, he meant an experience of grace or joy for them. But you understand that Paul is not being haphazard here. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's got clear aims. Just like they might have said about our Lord when he set his face to go to Jerusalem. That's crazy. You know what's going to happen when you get there.